Good morning. So we are at the Freiburg New Church Assembly. Today is Friday, August 9th. We're in the second hour. I'm Gard Perry. And my topic this morning is Good and Truth, an exercise in meta-translation by George F. Dole, a lecture given in 2006. So let me give a little background here as to why this lecture is happening in this way. First, I'd like to acknowledge Roz Taylor, who would have been here today. You know, she's in a difficult family situation, so our prayers are with her. She's okay. So she couldn't be here, and I was asked, or given the opportunity, what can we do? I said, well, I've got a lecture George Dole gave in 2006. I think it's one of the most important lectures he ever gave. And I will say why I believe that. So the case will be, I'm going to read his text as the first portion of this talk up to the point. It's about 2/3 of the text, so it's not necessary to read the whole text. I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm going to read an email I received from George. And at that point, there will be a pause. I'm going to ask you a question. What ought a person to do? And in response to that, it may be there will be time for me to answer that question. What ought one do in light of that email, which we'll all hear? After which we'll have time for discussion. And importantly, especially in light of the first talk, which was given by Roxanne, and I certainly feel very, very moved by that. There will be time at 11 for a half semicircle, and we can really get into some questions and some comments and some feeling and talk about the ideas that are presented in the first and in this talk. So with that, I thank you again for being here. So this talk started in May of 2006 when I and other colleagues of George were gathered at our annual regional peer supervision at Blairmont. Blairmont. That was a good one. Blair Haven. How many people have been to Blair Haven? Well, that was our retreat center for many years, and we were sharing, and George told the assembled in just a moment or two in which we were all checking in. He said, you know, I've just come from the annual meeting of the Swedenborg Foundation where I serve on the board, said George. I tried something a little different. I was asked to have a moment of a kind of learning moment or an educational minute, and I did what I'm now going to call meta-translation of a few section numbers from New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. And here's how it went, he read and said. We were stunned. I said, George, you've got to do that. Give a lecture. We want to hear more about that. So that was May of 2006. In August of 2006, George began as follows, standing here where I am standing. Good and Truth, an exercise in meta-translation. I'd like to start with kind of a parable, wrote George. Suppose you and I are on a trip and your car breaks down. You're looking for someone who can find out what's wrong and do something about it, and you wind up with a choice between two individuals. One grew up working on cars, though he's not very good at explaining things. Everyone in town turns to him when they have car troubles. The other has read everything ever written about cars and how they work, and everyone in town is impressed with his library. I trust that it's fairly obvious that this is a parable about the relationship between doctrine and life. The people who we turn to when we are hurting are not necessarily the people who can quote chapter and verse of the doctrines. They are the people who are more interested in understanding us than in lecturing us. I would suggest that the people are in fundamental agreement with us as to the meaning of word good. Some of them might be able to share their depth of understanding by writing books, and others might learn a lot by reading them. In a sense, then, the ideal mechanics are the ones who can take the general theories presented in the books and apply them to specific situations. No two of these situations will be exactly alike, which means that there is no possibility of a book that will describe every problem a mechanic can meet. That is why good mechanics will tell you that they learn something new every day. It will be something that fits in with what it says in the books, but it will go beyond the books in terms of detail. It will be a singular, quote unquote, that gives greater precision to some particular that fits an even more inclusive general of what that mechanic understands about cars. Thinking along these lines has led me to try something I am tentatively calling meta-translation. Meta being the prefix of Greek ancestry, meaning after or beyond. It involves regarding the general terms of the theological works, like good and true, as blanks, and filling them in so that, for example, when I read something about verum naturale, which is the Latin, or natural truth, I have to fill that blank with a specific instance of natural truth from my own everyday experience. It's a bit of a pain because it means I really have to stop and think. But I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll at least suspect that it might be worth it, writes George. The sample I'll be working with is from the little chapter in the little book. It's the chapter on good and truth from the New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. And he goes on, before taking that plunge, however, I want to call your attention to something, and he mentions Lee, by the way, that's Lee Woofenden, who also did a translation, not a meta-translation. Lee is a Latinist who did a translation, and his title of the New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching was and is the Holy City, a spiritual guidebook. So there you go. See how that's illuminating. So I begin again. I want to call your attention to something both Lee and I have observed about this material, namely that while it says at the outset that nothing is more important or necessary than knowing what good and truth is and how they are related to each other, it focuses on the latter necessity. However, it never defines either term. Swedenborg never says exactly in this text, particular text while he's with which he's working, what Swedenborg means by good. He does elsewhere, by the way, but not in this text. So George goes on to say, there are three basic premises of the following meta-translation that George provides. Three principles. The first is that in my own interpersonal relationships, what is good is actually caring about your well-being, and what is true is understanding you clearly. What is on your mind? What is in your heart? The second is that there are no two compartments in my soul, one containing my feelings and thoughts about you, and the other containing my feelings and thoughts about myself. I am to love the neighbor in the same way I love myself. I am to see myself in the same light in which I see my neighbor. And that light is the light of our faith. And the third is that I, George Dole, am a microcosm. And I will be accepted into heaven only if I accept heaven into myself. There is also an underlying premise, he observes, namely that heavenly happiness and eternal life are all about how we love and understand ourselves and others. The work itself he turns now to the work itself, which is the New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrine, represents Swedenborg's first overview of our theology. And it starts by saying almost exactly what I have been saying just now, namely that nothing is more important for us to know than what is good and what is true. Nothing is more important to know this, and it matters forever. That's George Dole on Swedenborg. And as only George Dole can say, with malice of forethought, then, I am going to read you first John Whitehead's translation from the Standard Edition, and then my meta-translation. And in the interest of time, I'm going to read the first 2 section numbers. There are 4, or a few more than that. We can read the other ones during the discussion after this, or during the question and answer period. But the first 2 are emblematic. They contain the whole and illustrate the difference between a standard translation and a meta-translation, which is really an interpretation by substituting lived experience into good and truth. Okay, first, here's John Whitehead. That's the Standard Edition, the Green 30. Section number 11, all things in the universe which are in accord with divine order have relation to good and truth. There is nothing in heaven and nothing in the world which does not have relation to these two. The reason is both good and truth proceed from the divine, from whom all things are. Section number 12. Hence it appears that there is nothing more necessary for a person to know what good and truth are, how the one respects the other, how the one is conjoined to the other. But such knowledge is especially necessary for people of the church. For as all things of heaven have relation to good and truth, so do all things of the church have relation to good and truth. Because the good and truth of heaven are also the good and truth of the church. It is on this account that a beginning is made in this work with good and truth, writes Swedenborg, translated by John Whitehead. Here's George. My entire humanity, to the extent that I am truly human, comes down to caring about you and wanting to understand you clearly. This applies to everything in my soul and in my body because both caring and seeing come from divinity, which is the source of everything. Clearly, then, this means that nothing is more relevant than knowing what true caring is and what clear sight is, so that I can love you, and knowing how the two interact, writes George. How, in fact, they are united. Caring and understanding are one. This is especially relevant to my relationships, because just as true caring and clear perception are at the heart of everything within me, they are at the heart of my relationships as well. That is why I need to get this straightened out first if I want to understand what life is all about. Well, there you have it. That's the jaw-dropping moment that some of us experienced in May, and that is his introduction to meta-translation. I trust it's pretty evident that there's quite a difference between the two. They are, I won't elaborate on this now because I'd like to finish George's talk, and then I'll have a pause. And this is really just two fairly substantial paragraphs. That kind of exercise, reflects George, brings me about 3/4 of the way to applying doctrine to life. The last step is filling in the blanks with specific names and specific instances with a particular you who wanted to share some concerns with me at 3:37 yesterday, with the specific feelings and thoughts that occurred to you as you presented and to me as I listened, writes George. And with the specific way I processed and then responded to those feelings and thoughts, or perhaps the specific you was the Jehovah's Witness who rang my doorbell at he writes 1923. I think that must be 2 o'clock in the morning. No, I don't know why he wrote 1923 a.m. on March 14th, or the telemarketer who called me in the middle of dinner yesterday. As you might expect, though, I'm still not quite through. It struck me quite forcibly when I reviewed the meta-translation that the lack of definition of goodness and truth was no longer an issue, he writes. In part, of course, because I had assumed a kind of definition by choosing caring and seeing you clearly as more specific instances, and that resolved any ambiguity. They're no longer abstractions. Those are things I experienced, writes George. But there is more to it than that, even, because there is no necessary unanimity as to what genuine caring is, or even as to what understanding another clearly is, he writes. But when we look at the relationship between them, though, something very interesting starts to happen. It turns out that each is a kind of test of the authenticity of the other. That is, if I think I care about you, but don't really understand you, don't really understand what is on your mind or in your heart, that can't be true caring. And if I think I see you clearly and what is on your mind and heart, but I am not moved to care for you, surely that is not clear sight. The more I think about it, he writes, the more rigorous this test seems to be. Try it. You might not like it. Yes, he did write that. Yes, you might not like it, as only George could do. Okay, there is a pause here, as predicted. Got an email to read, but maybe I'll just take a nod of the head. I mean, pretty powerful stuff, wouldn't you say? Pretty good. Big, big difference. Just for fun, I'm just going to read one more paragraph before getting to the email. We're going to pause after that, and then there's a follow-up section. So there's more to say. But when I was asked, or really offered in light of Roz's not being here, I said, you know, I've got this talk I could do. It is to summarize and read substantially what George wrote, yes. And I, like others, always like to hear what George Dole writes. This is literature. He's so good. And yet there's a follow-up too, which is, in a way, taking up a cause, taking up the cause of meta-translation. Let's just, for fun, I'm just going to read a couple more paragraphs. I read 11 and 12. Here's 13 and 14. Standard edition, and first, the Latin translation by the translators are always committed to translating the Latin words as they appear. So in all of the modern translations, including the New Century Edition, the terms good and true are maintained. Okay? It's better English. This is 19th century English. This is what you're about to hear. Section number 13. It is in accord with divine order that good and truth should be conjoined and not separated, thus that they should become one and not two, for they proceed in conjunction from the divine and are conjoined in heaven, and therefore they should be conjoined in the church. The conjunction of good and truth is called in heaven the heavenly marriage, and all there are in this marriage. Hence it is that in the word heaven is compared to a marriage, and that the Lord is called bridegroom and husband. But in heaven and also in the church, we are called the bride and the wife. That heaven and the church are so called is because they who are therein receive goods and truths. And finally, one short paragraph, 14. All the intelligence and wisdom which angels have is from that marriage, and not any of it from good separated from truth, or from truth separated from good. It is the same with people in the church. Okay, there you have it. Now let's listen to George. Section number 13. When I am functioning the way Lord created me to, my caring and my perception are not two activities, but are one single motion within my whole being. This is because they come from the Lord as a single energy and are a single energy in the very depths of my being. So they should be a single energy in my relationships to others as well. If I knew this oneness in depth, I would find myself referring to its intimacy as being like a marriage. All my ability to comprehend and to know comes from this oneness. Caring without perception accomplishes nothing, and perception without caring accomplishes nothing. This is true of my subconscious and of my conscious mind alike. There you have it. Pretty amazing. Okay, so now I have to pause and tell you something about this and George's career, his arc from 2006 until June of 2021, when he passed on into the next world. I said, George, this is important. And I remember others. I can remember, actually it happened to be Dean Curry sitting in the back listening to this talk, and I caught his eye afterward. He said, this is great. You guys ought to do this. I said, don't worry, George is on it. I said, George, come on, let's go. You've done 4 paragraphs. Keep going. Well, George was a very loyal professor. And he was recruited by, at the time, the dean, the Center for Swedenborgian Studies. George, we need you to teach the fall seminar in biblical exegesis. George, of course, had been the professor of biblical studies and theology at the Swedenborg School of Religion, where I attended, and Jim Lawrence had attended. And George retired, by the way, in the year 2000 approximately, moved from Sharon to Bath, and was going to begin living the life of a gentleman farmer, which George is also, a gentleman farmer, and many more things. He's actually a Renaissance man. He could build a clavichord, he could build a harpsichord, he could play the guitar, Scarlatti, he could write poetry, he could write scenes for a play, he could sing Sullivan and, Gilbert and Sullivan. You should hear him. So he was happily retired when Jim discovered they needed a professor. And George, would you please teach online? So George began to work as a professor, teaching a generation of theological students, fall semester, spring semester. Summers he was here, fall semester, spring semester, and the years went by, and then he was asked to do a seminar, and then he was asked to do a keynote speech at the convention. George, it's 2015. Please get to work on the meta-translation of that beautiful work, New Jerusalem. It's on my list, Gard. It's on my list. Just when I thought it was going to happen, he got a call from Jim, and there was a kind of a need for a new kind of course. Now they're going to be doing courses for the global community, and we need George to do one on the environment, because he had written the script for the movie. Somebody will remember the name of that beautiful movie, Images of Knowing. And now George is busy again. I'm about to read an email. George and I were in touch hundreds of times over the course of a year. Twice a week. He loved just to talk to me, and I basically was encouraging him. Come on, George, I love what you're doing. Keep doing it. Okay. So here's the email. George died on Monday, 25, 26, 27, June 28th, on a Monday. George was at a Mid-Coast hospital in Brunswick, surrounded by his family members, and he died. Acute case of pneumonia, basically. On Sunday, June 27th, he collapsed at home and he was taken to the hospital. Not knowing that would happen, George sat down on Friday, June 25th. He wrote me an email. He titled it like he always did, always some kind of great title. This was the subject line. This is the latest, he wrote. Dear Gard, I've moved the project of meta-translation of New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching to the front burner because the process of outlining a preface has come to me and a number of things have come together. And now he just launches into why he wants to do this meta-translation. He goes, Swedenborg's pervading intent was to restore the lost theology that made all religions one. This has to be brought forward again. Second, realizing this, Swedenborg, immediately started drafting New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. And third, the bulk of that booklet is about what is to be human. What it means to be human. That's what the book is about, New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. And how to become angelic. Fourth, he writes, that bulk makes virtually no sense, no use of Scripture or of biblical exegesis. Doesn't need to. He already did that in the Arcana, by the way. And this was published, the New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching was written and penned by Swedenborg immediately after finishing the Arcana. It's the first thing he did. Final and fifth, we should regard New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching as an outline of the theology of an inclusive global new church, which is real here and now. The present day, that church has billions of members in very good standing who are not even Christians. It should be the mission of today's Swedenborgian contingent of Christianity to start to try to rally the troops, so to speak. So that has led me to draft the attached document, which is kind of an overview of how he regards the whole work. I do have that document. We're not going to go into that today. It's a very general sort of outline of how it applies to the world today in real terms. So he was talking about drafting a kind of summary overview, and he said, I now see the remainder of that booklet as a statement that the Swedenborgian Church has a legitimate place in the global new church. And I believe it should be a leading place and think the time is ripe for the actual motion in that direction. No, we're not stuck, he said. Of course, we would be if we had to get somewhere. That was 2 days before he collapsed, 3 days before he died. So my question to you, what ought a person who was close to George, who received that email, in fact, who is a reader of Swedenborg's Latin and who collaborated with George over the course of the 2 decades after he penned his first installment of meta-translation, what is such a person supposed to do? What ought to be done? Any thoughts? Pick it up and carry on the work. I'll take 1 or 2 and then I will tell you how I answered that question. And we'll have time, I think. Hugh, do you want, I'd kind of, well, it's a rhetorical question. What ought a person, what should such a person do? Ignore that, or perhaps try to do something about it? Do something for the good of love. You know the answer? I know the answer? Okay, let me give you the answer. This is what I did. Did think about it for a long time. I did brush up on my Latin. I did try a few practice paragraphs. And then in May of this year, I wrote a letter to the dean of the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, and I wrote, as one who is aware that the licensed pastors are required to complete a course of study every year to satisfy a continuing education requirement, I wish to try my hand at teaching a 7-week course that satisfies that requirement for them. The attached document, you will find a course description, required reading, learning outcomes, and an assessment. You will see familiar material that expands on work that I was able to do for the Center for Swedenborgian Studies in January as an instructor. In it, you will see an expanded version of the New Jerusalem and its heavenly doctrine, and a study guide. Please accept my thanks in advance for consideration of and for your reply to my proposal. And here's the proposal. A 7-session course, 90 minutes each, reading Swedenborg as lived experience, reflections on George Dole's meta-translation. This 7-week online course is intended for licensed pastors who wish to deepen their engagement with Swedenborg's New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching, and to satisfy a portion of their annual continuing education requirement. This course introduces several ideas, first of which is connecting science and religion as a perspective from which to approach selected section numbers from the text. Secondly, an in-depth look at George Dole's methodology of meta-translation, which will inform the shift from general meanings in existing translations to meanings discovered within one's own lived experience. And finally, a 3-step listening process is provided to test the usefulness of the method. Each participant will be provided with a study guide linked to required reading to prompt independent study between sessions and discussions. So how about just a little taste of the reading list, which I don't have here, but I've memorized it. The reading list. George Dole's 2006 lecture, Meta-Translation, Good and Truth, the one you just heard. That's on the reading list. The second one is a 2014 mini course presented by George Dole as an overview of New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. The third is the George F. Dole Memorial Seminar, which presents George Dole's meta-translation and his own approach to theology through the lens of science. That was one of George's passions. The Universe and I, terrific book, does just that. And there were a couple other things on that list. So by way of illustration, I have up to 4 section numbers I'd like to read, of which I just said, okay, I'll give this a try. I won't read the standard edition translation. It reads a lot like what you've just heard. I'm just going to read the way my application of George's method comes out, starting with the first section number of New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching. And that, by the way, is in reflection. I'm just going to read a few verses from Revelation 21. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride before her husband. The city had a wall great and high, which had 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon which are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, in which were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. And as you know, it goes on, that section number. That's a biblical quote, of course, from Revelation 21. And Swedenborg comments on that. And this is how the meta-translation of that first section number comes out. Many people who read these words today understand them in the literal sense only. They think that the sky and the earth will perish and a new heaven will come into existence. The holy city, Jerusalem, will come down upon a new earth with the dimensions given in that description. But angels understand these words in a completely different way. For them, the biblical narrative illuminates an interior thought process insofar as it is in accord with what happens in heaven. Sacred images from the Bible invoke an interior force that transforms their minds and, importantly, can also transform our minds. Once that interior transformative force has taken hold, we will see that a new heaven and a new earth is a kind of new human community, both in heaven and upon the earth. And that the holy city coming down from God is the teaching about sacred community and how to live in it. Okay, that's section number 1. I've got a couple more to read just to give you a little taste of what it sounds like. I'm going to read this whole one. This is section number 9, and this is where Swedenborg turns from that introductory material and says, and now I'm going to tell you what this book is really about and why I'm writing it. Okay. The teaching about charity, which today we know as empathy, was the main teaching in ancient times. It informed all human relations and so made one out of many. Everyone recognized as members of their community all who had empathy, and so they called each other like-minded kin. Though their thought process might differ by a lot, they recognized that difference simply as their way of knowing. They liked to share unique features of their knowledge with each other, as this was among their pleasures and their kind deeds. No one took offense if someone failed to accept their viewpoint, knowing that each person accepts another's way of knowing only to the extent that it supports their love for others. Since ancient communities were of this kind, their members were interior people and were therefore wise. The inmost qualities of their minds were associated with like-minded angels in heaven. This had the effect of raising their minds even more inwardly and gave them wisdom. Wisdom comes only from heaven, which is to say, through heaven from the Lord. Wisdom exists in heaven because people there are in love with the Lord and have love for the neighbor. Wisdom is seeing others in a true light, which is the light of heaven. But the wisdom of the ancient people declined with the passage of time. The more human beings withdrew from the Lord's love and from love for one another, which is what empathy is, the more they withdrew from wisdom. And because they withdrew from wisdom, they withdrew from heaven. Human beings became successively more external, and when that happened, they became worldly and thought only about their own well-being. People like that don't care about things that have to do with heaven because they are in the grip of cares of this world and are attracted to whatever they find most pleasing. When they hear about life after death, heaven or hell, or anything interior, they think those things are outside of themselves and not inside, within, as they ought to be. This is why the teaching about real empathy, which was so highly prized by the ancients, is today one of the things that has been lost. Indeed, does anyone today know what empathy really is? And what about the real meaning of the neighbor? Yet the ancients not only knew these things, but countless others in addition, of which people today know less than 1,000th part. The whole Scripture, the sacred Scripture, is nothing but a teaching about love and how to love. Okay, that should do the trick. That's the, yes. I probably, I tried to make that clear. So that was the meta translation, a very, very different sound. So we're really up to time almost. It's 1:15 already. I will take any kind of comments or questions for 5 minutes, but more to the point, we're going to gather for an hour after this at 11 o'clock, and we can really get into some conversation. So keep your eyes open for hands. So I saw 3, by the way. Ian, Bob, no, Bob was scratching his head, and Roxanne.
One of George Dole's radical nephews gave a talk on translation several decades ago in which I said that there's no more right way to translate than there is to butter your toast. And today I would be even more radical and say that it's kind of, for me, it's a myth that the truth is on the page. The truth is when we apply it in our life and it becomes more love and connection between us. And the other thing, I think it was you, not Uncle George, who said just now that you made a distinction between translation and interpretation. And I don't really honor that distinction. That's a continuum.
Yeah.
When someone reads Latin, either to themselves, if two different people read Latin, they understand something differently. Yes. And if I read it out loud, you understand it differently. And so, yeah, it's a continuum, and it's a myth that there's some true translation. The end result is communication. It's the same thing as when we write and when we edit. We're trying to communicate to people, not make this direct. Again, it's just a myth that there's a direct communication. We're two different people. We're hearing different things. We're understanding different things. We're emphasizing different things. So to me, Uncle George's wonderful meta-translation concept it's just an extension of better communication, right. Really. The standard edition is lousy communication to today's era. And so go for it, more.
Thank you. So while you're passing the mic, your point is taken, and I agree 100% with you. I was representing a view I actually don't believe is that a Latinist may say that they're not interpreting, they're translating, and that is not the case. It is an interpretation. So I appreciate your observing that. Thank you. Roxanne.
Yeah, mine is very short and sweet, and I want to share with you a gift that George Dole gave me as I sat in one of the Zoom classes with him. It's so simple, but it's so profound. And I take this wherever I go. And he said, "The other deserves our curiosity." I think that's absolutely gorgeous, so beautiful, and so simple.
Lovely.
Uncle George would have loved Ted Lasso.
Okay, if I don't see another hand, we'll give the mic so I could hear what Ian said. Something about George's humor, maybe.
George would have loved Ted Lasso. I said yes. Be curious, not judgmental.
George would have loved Ted Lasso.
Oh, Ted Lasso. Okay, that was a cultural reference I didn't recognize right away. So I do now. Thank you.
I'm curious as to why that particular book of the writings drew you to, adding a different translation.
Could you speak up a little bit and then
sorry.
ask a question?
I'm sorry, I'm not talking loud enough.
Please ask your question.
Curious why you picked that book of the writings to work on.
Okay, that's well, I did not pick it. George Dole did.
Yeah.
Very important. Okay, so Swedenborg, his illumination occurred and do this in less than 2 minutes. Occurred in 1744, Easter Sunday. He had an encounter with the Lord, who received a commission, roughly included to provide the internal sense of the Word. So Swedenborg began to take that quite seriously. It took him several years, and he sat down to work on the Arcana, Secrets of Heaven, the Arcana Celestia. And he worked prodigiously on it. It took him 7 years, published in 1756. And if you look at that book, it has everything in it. It's about 5 books. It's his magnum opus. 5 books in parallel. Regeneration, glorification, spiritual history of the churches, the biblical exegesis. I'm going to finish in less than a minute. Swedenborg sat down, looked at what he wrote, and then he realized in the interchapter material, and this is what George pointed out, this was his thing. This was George's thing. He said, look what Swedenborg is writing now in the interchapter material in the book of Exodus. It's all about the lost teaching of charity, which by the way, meta-translation becomes in this work empathy. The lost teaching. So Swedenborg himself said, okay, before I go on to write Heaven and Hell, which was the next big work, and then in 1758 there were some shorter works, he simply pulled together things he'd already written with reference numbers and put them in the form of the New Jerusalem and its heavenly teaching, and as if to say, this is what you need to know. And George took it to heart, and now I do. And with that, we are up to time, so I do thank you for your attention.
Thank you.